Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here. I'm just in here drinking my morning coffee. For those saying that these are fake sips and it's not real coffee in the cup, there you go, there's real coffee. But you guys know what time it is. Time to talk about current events in the online fitness community. And for those of you who like these type of videos, please remember to click like down below. If you're not subscribed yet, hit the subscribe button. But over to the point. I've had someone link me a video by the guy named Delaney. Not familiar with him at all. But I thought he made a pretty decent video discussing his own problems and things that he's run into with cutting and some of the negatives to it for people who are cutting very, very lean. And this is something I always try to give the other side of the story on myself. I've done that for many years, and people will get upset and they'll make personal attacks at me against it. They're like, well, you're not a bodybuilder. Well, yeah, obviously not. I'm a strength athlete. Or you never get ripped. Well, yeah, obviously I don't get ripped. If you think something's not a good idea and that there are problems with it and then you choose not to do it, you're being pretty logically consistent, guys. But Joe, I think, broke down a lot of the problems, the common problems, and it's based on what he's done when he cuts and everything else, of his problems he has with it and things that people need to be aware of if they choose to go down this route. And I think if you look at a lot of the effects that he describes in the body, I think what people need to remember is that cutting down to an ultra low body fat is actually not a normal, natural, healthy thing for you to do. And people need to understand that. It is being done for a vanity purpose. It doesn't mean it's good for you, right? It doesn't mean it's good for you, and it doesn't mean that there aren't going to be problems with it. Just like something like breast implants. Women will get breast implants. They do it for vanity purposes, attractiveness purposes, but it isn't actually a particularly great thing to do to your body, right? You're not going to be a healthier person for having done it. In fact, you're going to carry risk of health effects. I'm not saying they're always going to be severe, but they're there. And cutting down to a really low body fat is part of that, and people need to grasp that. And that's one of the reasons I separate that from the fitness world. And I tell people that, if you want to focus upon fitness and athleticism and health, you need to be aware that cutting down to an ultra low body fat may not be part of that. That is a separate thing, and it's probably not good for any of those goals. So Joe broke down some of the issues. Number one, he felt that he had to have a really, really heavy dependence upon caffeine. Now, of course, I'm a caffeine addict, but I'm a coffee addict. I drink tons of it. And I have for many, many years, and I've come off of it before, and I didn't feel like it improved my life in any way. And we know there's data that coffee has certain health benefits. There's pretty good data on some of that. Unless you have certain medical issues that can be exacerbated by the caffeine, coffee itself is fine. But even I don't go do just these pure caffeine drinks. I don't buy caffeine pills. I don't do pre-workouts. I don't do any of that stuff personally. But it has to do with the lower energy levels, and he felt like he started to become dependent on caffeine. Now, I thought it was fascinating that he used that one first, because that was, quite frankly, the least out of any of the things. Like, that should have really almost been at the tail end of it, as far as the way he organized his video, because that's such a minor thing in comparison to the other stuff. The second one that he brought up was the binging. The binging, and that's, again, a big one. And that has to do with not just individual things and psychological things, because a lot of us are prone to binge eating. I'm prone to binge eating. I know that. I think we're all aware of that. But there's a certain amount of hormonal and psychological factors that play there for people who are predisposed to binge eating. And oftentimes it has to do with trauma and everything in your life and childhood, actually the big driver of that. But binge eating starts to eventually become a problem for most people who try to cut to really low body fats, and there's a reason for it. Your brain knows that you are starving yourself. It doesn't know that you're doing it intentionally or not. All it knows is that you are putting it into a period of starvation where you are restricting and losing body weight for an extended period of time. Historically, throughout all of human history, human beings have never intentionally done this to themselves. We are not designed for that. The only time that happens is unintentional. And that's the reason we have these different defense mechanisms, and people need to understand that. It is natural to regain your weight immediately when you lose weight. Okay, that's the normal thing to do, and it's because that's what keeps you alive. Because all throughout, for hundreds of thousands of years, The only time humans lost significant periods of weight is during starvation without access to food. So your natural inclination, particularly the longer you lose weight, is to binge the moment you have access, right? It's to binge and to force feed yourself and re-put on 15 pounds in a couple of days, if possible, hopefully within a week, because your body thinks that you've been going through a period of starvation. It thinks you're going to die. It doesn't know that you have the ability to turn it back off. As far as your brain is concerned, you need to binge. And so he discussed that could become an issue. He discussed his own strategies for working around that, dealing with that. But that should be something that people need to understand. That is because we're not supposed to do that to ourselves. And our brains know that, our bodies know that. And you have to remember this is something you're doing for vanity. And I like the point that he pointed out, that he doesn't want to just say, oh, I'm a tough guy in this hardship, because everyone needs to remember that. Any of you out there who are cutting to a low body fat, that's a choice that you're making. None of us have to do that. I mean, people even argue with me that if I did it, I would make a lot more money, but I make a comfortable income off of this stuff already as it is without doing that. So I could do it. I choose not to. I don't want to deal with all the negatives. That's why for me it's been a slow recomp personally. So you don't have to do it. None of you are ever in a life situation to where you have to force yourself to cut to a low body fat. It's all optional. Very, very, very few of you is your actual career going to depend upon it. Okay, it's an optional hobby. So when people do this whole hardship thing, he is right. You need to make fun of those people because it's intentional. They're intentionally putting themselves through that. And no one feels bad for someone who basically stands there if they're hammering a nail into their own foot. No one stands there and feels bad for them every time they hit it if they go, ow. Okay? You could just not hit it again. You not drive the nail any deeper and the problem will go away. It's a choice you're making. So it gets silly. And he is right, though, that you really shouldn't make a big deal about it because people are going to really, really dislike you if you make a big deal about the hardships you're going through for a self-inflicted cut. Okay? Because you're doing it for vanity. So over to the next point that he made was the food obsession. The food obsession. He actually noticed that he became so obsessed with food when he gets into a cut that it's all he thinks about day and night. To the point to where he felt like it made him a weirdo because he would try to talk to people. Oh, this is what I have for calories left. And then he steps back and says, my roommate doesn't care about this. My friends, these people don't care what calories I have left. I'm just coming across as a weird freak. And that's true because the food obsession that happens for a prolonged cut as you get leaner and leaner is part of it. And it's because your brain wants you to think about food. It wants you to be thinking about food so much that you binge and eat because it's starving. Okay? And in order to do that to yourself, because you're putting yourself into a psychologically and physiologically abnormal situation, you're going to have to use defense mechanisms in your brain to where you become obsessive oftentimes to continue to do so. Which is why, as Joe pointed out rightly, this does tend to lead to eating disorders. And that's the other thing I would say to people. If you have any history of real eating disorders, okay, if you have a history of real eating disorders, cutting down and getting ripped is probably a really, really bad idea. Okay, it is a really bad idea. Like with me, I know I have a history of binge eating. Let's come over to that. Be consistent in that. And there's a whole lot of you out there who have histories of this stuff who still decide to get ripped. And then you end up developing a full-blown eating disorder again, sometimes worse than what you originally had. Not a wise idea. Be aware that the food obsession can happen. The next one he brought up is, again, the loss of sex drive. The loss of sex drive, loss of muscle mass too. But that's normal also, and people need to remember that. Let's come over to the point. A lot of guys think that if they get really ripped, it's going to help them get girls or whatever. But then oftentimes you'll have a loss of libido, erectile dysfunction, everything else, particularly if you cut fast. So we get over to that point of thinking this through logically. Thinking it through logically. Cutting to a body fat that's so low that you cannot perform, that you're not even interested. It's kind of defeating the point because most of the guys who are doing this are doing it because they think they want to look good. But then you turn yourself into a eunuch. See the problem? This is not helpful. This is a really bad reason to cut down and get ripped. And we kind of come over to another point I make historically, and I'm not trying to be pro-anabolic here, But anyone who wants to go under 10% body fat natural, I don't understand why you would want to do that. It's absurd. It's absurd. It is the most absurd thing you could possibly do. Because it's, again, going to tend to cost you your muscle mass. It's going to cost you your muscle mass, it's going to cost you your libido, everything else. People probably need to be putting exogenous hormones into their body if they decide they're going to go this route. And then they'll come around and say, well, that's not natural and that could be harmful to health or whatever. It's like you're already doing something unnatural and harmful to your health. The actual cutting to 8% body fat is not natural and it's harmful to your health. Okay? You're already there. You don't really get to use that excuse anymore. Again, it's a ridiculous excuse at that point because you're intentionally inflicting self-harm on yourself, and then you don't want to do something that would offset some of the self-harm because you're scared of inflicting self-harm on yourself. It's really this big catch-22, isn't it? So let's come over to the point. Without me going any further with that, if you're choosing to be natural and you cut down to a ripped body fat, it's absurd. That's the most absurd thing I've ever heard of. It really is. I don't get it. I don't understand the point. We come over to the main thing. Let's talk about the loss of muscle tissue. I mean, if you're doing it completely clean, you are going to lose muscle tissue no matter what. It is impossible otherwise. And Joe got that wrong because he said, well, I think the reason for it is because, as your workouts get harder because your energy is low, because your deficit's too high, your workouts suffer and you can't train as hard and therefore you start losing muscle on the cut. Well, that's part of it. But you lose muscle on the cut almost always. Unless you find a way to work around it, unless you find a way to train enough to stimulate muscle growth, muscle loss is actually a normal part of weight loss for non-lifters, right? People who haven't even built muscle yet. We know that a standard caloric deficit in non-lifters, when it's measured, like at least a fourth of the weight they lose is lean tissue. So if you go take people they've studied over the years, it's an obese person, when they lose every 20 pounds they lose, at least 5 of it is lean tissue, even people who don't train. That's normal. Lean tissue loss is part of weight loss. It happens. If anything, it's that you have to find ways to train very specifically and especially to even maintain what you have. And when you start reaching that threshold, like that 10% or lower range, you are not going to maintain your muscle tissue. You are going to lose some. It is going to go away. So you've also got to question the point of, and this is what I bring up to people, if you want to get really lean, and to me, I would say really lean is anything under 15% body fat. Number one, do it slowly. Number two, don't cut to a body fat you don't plan on staying at, because it's going to cost you muscle. It is going to cost you muscle mass. It's going to cost you lean tissue. It's going to cost you trauma if you cut to a body fat that you're not going to sustain. So then you're going to be there and you have lost something that you then have to regain. So my advice is, based on everything he said, don't go do something dumb like be natural and try to cut down really ripped. That's stupid. Number two, don't cut really lean if you have a history of eating disorders. Number three, don't cut to a body fat that you don't plan on staying at long term. Right? This whole bulking and cutting cycle that people do the way they do it is absurd. It's absolutely absurd unless you need to cut. Unless you absolutely need to cut for health reasons or because you're really fat. Most of you who are lifting shouldn't even be doing that. You should be thinking in terms of just recomposition. Right? You should be thinking in terms of recomposition and focusing on making leaner gains if possible without these big bulk and cut cycles, because they're problematic all the way around. Just my opinion. All right, guys, so that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.